So this chapter will cover the basics of integumentary system. So we've already looked at different types of tissues. In this, we'll learn a little bit more about neoplasm that can be the cause of cancerous tissues. We'll look at the functions of skin, nails, and hair. And we'll learn more about the different layers of the skin. In the histology lab, we looked at keratinized and non-keratinized skin under the microscope. So we'll study a little bit more in detail about the different types of layers in skin and epithelial tissue on the skin. So the tissues of the body are mainly of 4 different types. The first one is epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. Now, epithelium lines the cavities and covers the internal organs as well as the skin. Muscles include cardiac muscles, skeletal muscles, and smooth muscles. Nervous tissue is a main form of communication. So all the neurons and glial cells help in transferring a signal to the central nervous system or to the effector to perform a function. And the last type of tissue we looked at was connective tissue. Connective tissue connects different parts of the body. So basically, everything that's a filler can be a type of connective tissue. So the skin that is layered with epithelial tissue, but there are certain tissues that are present in the membranes of the body. And we have cutaneous membrane, which is the actual biggest part of the body, which is the skin. So skin is the largest organ. It's mostly dry, especially in the regions that are exposed to the external environment. Certain types of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue is found in the wet and slippery regions of the body, like the oral cavity and the genital regions. The next type of membrane is the mucous membrane, which lines the cavity that open to the outside of the environment, like the vaginal tract and the nasal cavity. And then you have the serous membrane that line closed cavity. For example, there's a serous membrane surrounding the heart that prevents heart from friction with the surrounding organs. Then we have the synovial membranes. Synovial membranes line closed cavities of joints. So they are also a fluid-filled membrane, and we call the fluid a synovial fluid. So if you remember from our lecture on synovial joints, you should know what type of fluid fills the synovial cavities. Now, the other type of tissue which is not really been observed in labs are neoplasms. Neoplasm is an abnormal and excessive growth of a tissue, and it's called neoplasia. Now, the neoplasms can be benign or malignant. So in a sense, cancer is a type of neoplasm that can grow rapidly and spread to cause damage to the body. So we have benign neoplasms and malignant neoplasms. So which parts of the body do you spend most money on? So it's probably, maybe some of you might be thinking it's the stomach, or maybe medical checkup. But really, if you think about it, we spend most money on our skin. We buy a lot of products for bathing. If you want to relax in a hot bath, we buy some Epsom salt, and we like to spend money on shampoos and makeup and hair and nails. So really, skin is the most expensive part of the body that we try to take care of. So this chapter will mainly cover the integumentary system. The integumentary system includes the skin, its accessory organs, including the hair, nails, and the accessory glands, as well as the blood vessels that supply nutrients to the cells of the integumentary system. And then we also have muscles and nerve endings that help in acting when we, say, touch a hot stove, and nerve actually helps in communicating any change in the external stimulus. So the study of the medical specialty that deals with treatment or disorders of the integumentary system is called dermatology. Okay. So the functions of the skin include to provide protection, and it can be physical, chemical, or physiological protection. Now, physical protection, of course, we have a layer of keratinized squamous epithelium that make up the external-most layer of the skin. This prevents us from physical injury. So we scoff off almost 1 kilogram of dead skin tissue every year. So most of the dust particles you see around the room are actually just dead layers of the skin. And then the skin provides chemical protection. Now, skin contains peptides, which are small proteins like molecules, which are antimicrobial in nature. So these are specifically dermicidin and defensin proteins that help in preventing bacterial infection. And then we produce a lot of sebum and sweat, which add to the additional protection of the skin. And physiological protection is provided by some specialized cells like the Langerhans cells. And we'll talk a little more in detail about the main cells in the skin that help in the first layer of defense. So your skin really provides the first layer of defense. And then in older people, skin also plays a very important role in excretion when their kidneys begin to malfunction. So they help in removal of nitrogenous wastes from the body. So if you have ever worked with older people or in a nursing home, they smell like urea, but it's not really that they're peeing themselves. It's just because their skin picks up some part of functions of the kidney and help in excretion of nitrogenous waste. Now, the other very important function of the integumentary system is to synthesize vitamin D. Now, when light penetrates your skin, it alters a compound known as cutaneous 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is present in the skin. This alteration causes the creation of a vitamin D precursor. Now, your body cannot directly use the vitamin D, which is really called vitamin D3, before it becomes biologically active. The vitamin D3 travels to the liver, where it is converted to active and usable vitamin D. Finally, in the kidneys is where it happens. So it's a very, very long process, but the skin carries out the first step. Some other functions of the skin include sensation and sensory reception. So skin contains tactile receptors which help in sensing a change in pressure or pain, and it contains Merkel cells that sense a change in external pressure. It also acts as a thermoregulator, and the blood vessels in the skin constrict or dilate when needed. Now, we also have some specific muscles in the skin which have tiny hair-like structure that stand up when we feel cold. So it's called erector pili. So the skin is also, used for non-verbal communication like facial expression. So the changes you show on your face shows what type of message you're trying to communicate. Now, the skin is the largest organ and is the heaviest organ. It contains 3 major layers: the epidermis, dermis, and the hypodermis, which is the subcutaneous layer. Now, the outermost layer is called the epidermis, the second layer is called the dermis, and the subcutaneous layer, also known as hypodermis, is the third layer. Now, hypodermis is a layer where they actually provide or inject hypodermal needles, because we actually have a lot of bigger blood vessels in the hypodermal region of the skin. So this picture shows the 3 different layers. The outermost layer is the epidermis. This is the second layer, which is the dermis, and the third layer is the hypodermis, which contains subcutaneous fat. So this yellow structures in here are representative of fat cells or adipocytes that you looked at under the microscope. So the outermost layer of the skin is mostly keratinized, at least, on your hands, legs, and anything that is in contact with the external environment. It's heavily keratinized on the surface, and keratin makes the skin waterproof. So this region of the skin is avascular, meaning it lacks blood vessels, and the bottommost layer is actually a layer of live cells, and as these layers move closer to the top, they keratinize and become a layer of dead cells. Now, nutrition to the topmost layer solely depends on the process of diffusion of nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. So this layer of the skin also contains really sparse nerve endings, so we can sense any change in the external environment. There are 4 main types of cells in the epidermis. You have the keratinocytes that produce keratin. Keratin makes the skin waterproof, and that's why when you take a bath, you don't really soak up all the water. And then you have melanocytes. Melanocytes provide skin color due to the pigment that is inside, and we call it melanin. And then you have Langerhans cells. These cells are macrophages, so they are phagocytic cells. They're phagocytic cells that are involved in the first layer of defense or the immune response. So Langerhans cells are modified macrophages which originate in the bone marrow and migrate to the oral cavity, esophagus, and openings like the vagina. And they guard us against toxins, microbes, and other pathogens that may penetrate through the skin. So these cells are phagocytic in nature, meaning they eat up the antigen and present it on the surface to activate the immune system. And the fourth type of cell is the Merkel cells. The Merkel cells are the tactile cells of the skin. So tactile cells basically sense the touch associated with the nerve fibers. Okay, so this cell together is called the Merkel cell, and this disc over here is the Merkel disc, also known as the tactile disc. So it senses any change in pressure in the environment and carry the sense to the sensory neuron, which is later transmitted to the spinal cord and the central nervous system. So all cells of the epidermis originate from stem cells. So stem cells are undifferentiated, meaning they do not have an identity. They have not decided what to become. So they are baby cells which can differentiate into any different type of cell. Now, all cells originate from stem cells, and keratinocyte is also a cell that originates from the stem cell. The first type of epidermal cell we looked at was the keratinocyte. So keratinocyte make up most of the stratified squamous keratinized epithelial tissue. They synthesize keratin, and then you have the melanocytes. So main function of melanocytes is to secrete melanin, and they shield us from UV radiation. So there are some other enzymes in the skin that help in repairing any kind of DNA damage. But melanocytes are the ones that play a very important role in secreting melanin, which also gives us skin color. And they are found in the deepest layer of the skin, which is stratum basale. So we'll look at the basal layer in just a second, but keep in mind these melanocytes are found in the stratum basale, which is the innermost layer of the epidermis. Now there's a misconception that people who are darker cannot get sun damage. Melanocyte solely repairs UV radiation damage. So people with more melanin in their skin are less prone to sun damage and skin cancer, but that does not prevent them from getting sunburn. So Merkel cells, Merkel disc, or tactile discs are the touch receptors associated with nerve fibers in the epidermis, and they are found in the basal layer of the epidermis. And then you have the Langerhans cells, which are found in the layer known as stratum spinosum and stratum granulosum. So these are the cells that are involved in the first layer of defense. So this picture over here shows a close-up view of the different layers of epidermis. You can see these green cells are the dendritic cells, also known as Langerhans cells. So these are the cells that are involved in the first layer of defense. Then you have these yellow ducts, which form the sweat ducts. You have a lot of sweat ducts in areas where you sweat a lot, like the armpit and the groin. And then you have the next special cell, which is the melanocytes. These brown cells are melanocytes. They produce melanin. And these blue cells in here are tactile cells or Merkel discs that help in sensing external pressure in the environment. Now, the other cell we talked about is the stem cell. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells, so they can differentiate into several different types that you see in the skin. Now, the first layer of the epidermis, all the way on the top, so this dry part of the skin that you're touching, is actually stratum corneum. Right under the stratum corneum, you have stratum lucidum, and stratum granulosum is the third layer. Stratum spinosum is the fourth layer, and the bottommost layer of the epidermis is stratum basale. So this layer over here is the layer of basal cells, and if you can see, they're closely associated with the next layer and also some blood vessels. So the only way nutrients can diffuse into the epidermis is through diffusion. Now, the most actively dividing layer of the epidermis is stratum basale. These cells divide mostly by mitosis, so all these cells that are formed are alike, and the chromosome makeup in each of these cells is the same. Now, the stratum basale consists of the basement membrane at the bottom, which connects it to the deeper underlying connective tissue. And desmosomes are nothing but junctions between the cells. So anywhere you see the word desmosome, these are just junctions that connect adjacent cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton, the skeleton of two cells, are connected together with the help of desmosomes. Okay. Now the next layer is stratum spinosum. In stratum spinosum, you see a lot of keratin fibers and lamellar bodies. Now, keratin fibers are accumulated by keratinocytes, and then the third layer, stratum granulosum, is a hard layer in which a lot of cells release the keratin lipids and then they start dying off. So these are the only two layers, layer 1 and 2, which is stratum basale and spinosum, where you can find live cells. And as they move up, they age and finally form a layer of dead cells. Okay, so for your purposes, make sure you know the 5 different layers of epidermis, and make sure you know that only the bottom 2 layers have live cells. The top layers, the cells are mostly a layer of dead cells. So as the cells push towards the surface, you only have a dead layer which is full of keratin and dead cells. So over time, keratinocytes flatten and produce more keratin and membrane coating vesicles. In about 30 to 40 days, the keratinocytes that are way at the bottom, they move to the top, and eventually they get exfoliated or they flake off. So this process is slower in older age, but it's really fast in injured and on a stressed skin. And these are the cells types that give rise to calluses or corns, which is a thick accumulation of dead keratinocytes in a particular region on the skin. So the next layer of the skin right under the epidermis is the dermis. The dermis can be divided into the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So this layer is rich in blood vessels, and it also contains the root of hair follicles. So the actual hair that you see on your skin is just the shaft of the hair. And right where the epidermis meets the dermis, you see something called as dermal papillae. So dermal papillae are the junction between dermis and the epidermis. And the dermal papillae produce extensions of the dermis, which make, the fingerprints that you see on the finger. The epidermal ridges are these downward waves of the epidermis. So both these dermal papillae and epidermal ridges together produce the fingerprints that you see on your skin. Now the first layer, which is the papillary layer, is made up of thick bands of collagen fibers, and it allows some room for mobility of white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. So these leukocytes act as the first layer of defense. Along with leukocytes, which act as the first layer of defense, they also contain some really tiny blood vessels, and the nutrients from these blood vessels can only diffuse into the epidermis, because the epidermis does not have any direct blood supply. Now, the next layer of the dermis is the reticular layer. The reticular layer is a deeper and thicker layer of dermis. It consists of dense, irregular connective tissue. And now the reticular layer is rich in collagen as well. So the stretch marks, which is caused by, say, obesity or pregnancy, is really due to the tears in the collagen fibers in the reticular layer. Okay. So the third layer of the skin is the hypodermis. So the hypodermis forms the sub-Q layer, or the subcutaneous tissue. This, you can see, is rich in adipose tissue, which contain adipocytes filled with lipids or fats. Now, this is a common site for drug injections because it has really big blood vessels. And the subcutaneous fat also helps in long-term storage of energy. It helps in thermal insulation, and this layer is thicker in women and really thin in the infants and elderly. So these were the three layers of the skin. So the next portion is about melanocytes that produce skin color.